"Come inside, I'm waiting." That's what the girl told the mountain man, standing barefoot in the snow, her thin sleep dress whipping in the wind. He thought she was lost, or mad, but she wasn't shivering at his door for warmth alone. Behind her were boot tracks, men's boots, leading back down the trail to a burned-out cabin, and in her trembling hands, a metal box holding a paper worth more than gold, a claim to the only meadow the railroad needs. He's a man who's sworn off the world, hiding from the ghosts of his past. She's a girl the world's tried to trade, sell, and bury, but the snow's not their only enemy. Riders are coming. Keys will turn in the jail. The church bell will toll. And the valley will have to choose. Stand with the railroad's coin, or with the strangers who just became a family. Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The wind howled through the timberline, driving sheets of snow against Amos Cutter's small trapper's shack. Inside, the mountain man worked methodically by lamplight, his weathered hands steady as he skinned a young deer hung from the cabin's central beam. The flame flickered in its glass housing, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls lined with dried herbs and cured pelts. The knife slid smoothly beneath the deer's hide when a sharp knock cut through the storm's roar. Amos froze, his fingers tightening around the bone handle. In 15 years of living this high up the mountain, no one had ever come calling during a blizzard. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Setting his knife aside, Amos wiped his hands on a cloth and reached for the rifle propped by the door. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved closer, listening. The wind rattled the shutters, making it hard to hear anything else. "Who's there?" he called out, voice gruff from disuse. No answer came, just another knock. Keeping the rifle ready, Amos unbolted the door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance. Snow swirled into the cabin, along with a blast of frigid air that made the lamp flame dance wildly. There on his doorstep stood a girl, no more than 17 or 18 years old. Her thin cotton nightdress clung to her plump frame, dark with melting snow. She was barefoot, her toes already blue from cold, and her brown hair hung in wet tangles around a round, flushed face. Despite her dire situation, her eyes met his steadily. "Come inside," she said clearly, as if she were the one offering shelter rather than seeking it. "I'm waiting." Amos stared at her, bewildered by both her presence and her bold manner. "Where'd you come from, girl?" he demanded, scanning the darkness behind her for others. She lifted her chin, avoiding the question entirely. "Are you going to let me freeze out here?" "Listen here," Amos said, his voice hardening. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to head back wherever you came from. This ain't no place for a young woman alone." Instead of leaving, the girl sat down deliberately in the snow, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I'd rather freeze than go back," she declared, though Amos could see her shivering violently now. The snow was falling harder, thick flakes catching in her hair and on her shoulders. Amos cursed under his breath. Whatever trouble this girl was running from, he couldn't leave her to die in the storm. It went against everything he believed about helping those truly in need, no matter how inconvenient. "Get in here," he growled, reaching down to pull her to her feet. She stumbled inside, leaving wet footprints on his floor. Amos shut the door against the wind and grabbed a worn quilt from his bed, throwing it around her shoulders. "Sit by the fire before you catch your death." The girl huddled close to the stone hearth where embers still glowed. Her teeth chattered as she pulled the quilt tighter, but her eyes remained alert, taking in every detail of the cabin's interior. Amos moved to the iron pot hanging at the edge of the fireplace. There was still some venison stew left from his supper. He added more wood to the fire and swung the pot over the growing flames to warm. "You got a name?" he asked, watching her carefully. Something about her desperate flight through the snow spoke of real danger, not just some childish tantrum. "Lila May," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Lila May Hargrove." Amos nodded slowly, stirring the stew. Well, Miss Hargrove, once you've warmed up some, we're going to have a proper talk about what brought you to my door in the middle of a blizzard. She didn't respond, just pulled the quilt closer and stared into the flames. The wind continued to moan outside, rattling the shutters. While inside the cabin, an uneasy silence settled between the strange pair. Amos couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had driven this girl to flee barefoot into a snowstorm would eventually come looking for her. He checked that his rifle was still within easy reach, then focused on getting some hot food into his unexpected guest. Looking at her huddled form, he noticed angry red marks on her wrists, partially hidden by the quilt. The kind of marks that came from fighting against rope bindings. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice neutral as he ladled stew into a tin bowl. "Eat this," he said, holding it out to her. "Then we'll talk about what kind of trouble you're really in." Lila May accepted the bowl with trembling hands, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Cutter," he supplied. "Amos Cutter." She nodded, then fell silent again, spooning the hot stew into her mouth with single-minded focus. Amos returned to his deer, keeping one eye on the girl and one on the door, waiting for whatever storm was surely coming, and he didn't mean the one currently raging outside his cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth as Amos stirred the venison stew, the wooden spoon scraping against the iron pot. Outside, the wind's mournful howl seemed to mirror the unspoken tension filling his small cabin. Lila May sat hunched by the flames, the quilt pulled tight around her shoulders, her bare feet slowly regaining their natural color in the warmth. "You said your name's Lila May Hargrove?" Amos kept his voice gentle, like he might use to calm a spooked horse. "Where's your cabin at?" She stared into the fire, her fingers twisting in the quilt's worn fabric. "Down the trail, past Willow Creek, near the old lightning-struck pine." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's a fair piece to walk in a storm, especially barefoot." Amos ladled more stew into her empty bowl. "Your ma know you're out in this weather?" At the mention of her mother, Lila May's shoulders stiffened. "She knows what she did," she said, her voice cracking. She took a shaky breath, then added, "2 railroad men came by last week. Said they were surveying for a new line." Amos's hand tightened on the ladle. He'd seen their type before, men who used their position to take advantage of isolated homesteads, especially those run by widows. "They keep coming back," Lila May continued, her words tumbling out faster now. "Ma serves them whiskey, lets them stay late. Tonight, she—" Her voice broke again. "She told me to make myself useful to them. Said it might help us keep the land." The ladle clattered against the pot as Amos set it down harder than he meant to. Lila May flinched at the sound, her eyes darting to the rifle propped against the wall. "No need to fear that," Amos said gruffly. "Won't be used against you." He scratched his beard, considering. "Come morning, I'll take you back home and straighten things out with your ma. Those men won't be bothering you again." Lila May's face fell, but she didn't argue. They finished their meal in silence, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the endless keening of the wind. Amos gave her his bed, taking the floor for himself near the door, his rifle close at hand. Dawn broke pale and quiet, the storm spent but leaving behind knee-deep snow that glittered in the early light. Amos saddled his old mule, Jenny, while Lila May stood wrapped in borrowed clothes, a wool shirt that hung past her knees, thick socks, and his spare boots, stuffed with rags to make them fit. "It'll be slow going," he warned, helping her mount. She settled awkwardly in the saddle, clearly unused to riding. Amos led Jenny on foot, breaking trail through the fresh snow. As they made their way down the mountain, Lila May studied his broad back. "Why do you live up here all alone, Mr. Cutter?" Amos trudged on for several steps before answering. "Had my fill of bad company in the past," he muttered finally. "Prefer keeping to myself these days." The sun climbed higher as they descended, making the snow blindingly bright. Amos kept them to the safest path, avoiding deep drifts and ice-slick rocks. They were rounding a bend near Willow Creek when Lila May gasped. Amos looked up and stopped dead in his tracks. Where her cabin should have been stood a blackened skeleton of timber and stone. Wisps of smoke still rose from the ruins, making the snow steam where hot embers lay buried. The acrid smell of burnt wood and scorched metal carried on the crisp morning air. Jenny snorted and pawed the ground nervously. Lila May's hands gripped the saddle horn so tight her knuckles showed white. "Ma?" she called out, her voice thin with fear. "Ma!" Only the whisper of wind through bare branches answered her cry. The scene spoke its own dark story. Someone had wanted to leave no trace, no witnesses. The railroad men had likely watched Lila May flee, then decided to eliminate any evidence of their visits, whether her mother had escaped or not remained to be seen. Amos reached up and gripped Lila May's arm, steadying her as she swayed in the saddle. "We'll search for signs," he said firmly. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." The girl didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the smoking ruins of her home. The pretty speech she'd prepared for confronting her mother died unspoken on her lips, replaced by questions that hung heavy as storm clouds in the winter sky. Amos pulled Jenny's reins tight, his weathered hand raised to halt Lila May's movement. His eyes swept the scene before them, taking in details that told a grim story. The snow around the cabin's blackened bones was churned with hoof prints, the patterns speaking of multiple riders who'd lingered long enough to ensure their work was done. "Ma!" Lila May's cry pierced the winter stillness as she slid from the saddle. She stumbled forward through the deep snow, but Amos's hand shot out, catching her arm. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice low and firm. His grip gentled when she tried to pull away. "Ain't no one alive in there, child. Smoke's wrong color, been burning all night." Tears froze on her cheeks as she stared at the ruins. But maybe she got away. Maybe she's hurt somewhere. "Let me look first." Amos tied Jenny to a pine branch and drew his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay by the mule." He approached the smoking structure carefully, testing each step. The snow had partially doused the flames, but heat still radiated from the collapsed timbers. Through the haze, he spotted a heavy trunk, its lid warped, but mostly intact where it had fallen against the stone chimney. Keeping one eye on the surrounding forest, Amos used his boot to kick aside some charred boards. The trunk's metal fittings were black with soot, but its contents might have survived. He worked the damaged lid open with the barrel of his rifle. Inside, protected by layers of quilts, sat a small metal box. Its hinges were darkened but whole. Amos extracted it carefully, brushing away ash. The latch was still sound. "Found something," he called softly to Lila May. She waded through the snow to his side, her borrowed boots leaving deep prints. The box's lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a single folded document. Amos recognized the official seal before he'd even opened it fully. A United States land patent, the paper still crisp and clean. "It's got your name on it," he said, surprise coloring his voice. "Patent for 160 acres down in River Meadow." Lila May's brow furrowed as she peered at the document. "I don't understand. How could I own land? Pa died 2 years ago, and Ma never mentioned—" "Your pa was thinking ahead." Amos studied the patent's details. "This meadow, it's prime bottomland, flat as a table, perfect for—" He broke off, comprehension dawning. "Perfect for laying railroad track?" A sound carried on the wind. The distant jingle of harness brass, the muffled thud of hooves in snow. Amos's head snapped up, his body tensing. "Into the trees," he ordered, stuffing the patent inside his coat. Quick and quiet now. He grabbed Jenny's reins, leading her and Lila May into the timber. The mule's broad hooves helped break trail through the deep snow as they pushed away from the cabin site. After 50 yards, they struck a narrow deer trail that wound uphill beneath snow-laden branches. They traveled in tense silence, Amos checking their back trail regularly. The winter sun crept across the sky as they climbed higher into the mountains. Despite Amos's borrowed coat, Lila May shivered continuously, her face pale with cold and exhaustion. By dusk, the temperature had dropped sharply. Lila May stumbled more frequently, her borrowed boots dragging through the snow. Amos studied the darkening sky, then the trembling girl. "We'll hole up at my place," he said finally. "Need to figure who's behind this and why." He didn't voice his suspicions about the railroad men, but his jaw tightened at the thought. "What about Ma?" Lila May's voice was small, lost. Amos chose his words carefully. "Whoever set that fire knew what they were doing. Your Ma, ... He paused. "Don't reckon she made it out. I'm sorry, child." Lila May's shoulders shook, but no sound escaped her. She walked on, one foot in front of the other, as tears froze on her cheeks. "That patent's worth fighting for," Amos continued quietly. "Your pa made sure it was in your name, not your ma's, not anyone else's. He must have known something was coming." He glanced at the sky again. "Question is, who else knows about it?" The wind picked up, driving loose snow between the trees. Lila May huddled deeper into her borrowed coat, her face drawn with grief and cold. Amos led them onward through the gathering darkness, his mind working over the puzzle of the land patent and the violence it had spawned. Someone had killed for that document, he was certain. Someone who didn't know it had survived the fire. For now, his cabin was the safest place for both Lila May and the patent, though Amos suspected that safety might prove temporary once word spread that the girl had survived. Moonlight filtered through the pine boughs as Amos and Lila May finally reached his cabin. The temperature had plummeted, their breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. Inside, the hearth held nothing but cold ashes. "Sit there," Amos directed, pointing to a rough-hewn chair. He struck a match to light his oil lamp, then knelt at the fireplace. His fingers, stiff with cold, arranged kindling and split logs. Soon, a small flame caught, growing steadily as he fed it larger pieces of wood. Lila May huddled close to the growing warmth, her face drawn with exhaustion. The day's events seemed etched in the shadows under her eyes. When the fire blazed properly, Amos pulled his bedroll from the storage chest. "Take the bunk," he said, gesturing to the narrow bed built against the wall. "It ain't much, but it's warm enough." "Where will you sleep?" Her voice was hoarse with fatigue. "Chair'll do me fine." He settled into the wooden seat, rifle across his knees. "Been in worse spots." Lila May didn't argue. She curled up on the thin mattress, still wearing his spare coat. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Amos stayed awake long into the night, watching the fires dance across the log walls, his mind churning over the day's revelations. Dawn brought crystal-clear skies and bitter cold that made the snow crunch like broken glass. After stoking the fire, Amos pulled on his snowshoes. "Going to check my trap line?" he told Lila May. "Won't be gone long. Keep the door latched." The morning air bit at his face as he made his rounds. 2 snowshoe hares had found his snares, enough for a decent meal. When he returned, Lila May had heated water for coffee in the battered pot he'd left by the hearth. While she prepared the hares for cooking, Amos studied his worn map of the territory. "Reckon we ought to ride into town," he said finally. "Man there might help us sort this out." "Reverend Dowell. Known him some years now. He's got honest eyes." "Can we trust him?" Lila May looked up from her work, wariness clear in her expression. "Far as I trust anyone," Amos folded the map. "He ain't the sort to take bribes or tell tales, and he might know something about your pa's land dealings." They ate quickly, the meat tender from slow cooking. After cleaning up, Amos helped Lila May mount Jenny. The mule's broad hooves would serve them well in the deep snow. The journey was slow going. Drifts had filled the trail, forcing Amos to break path while leading Jenny on foot. The sun climbed high overhead, offering little warmth despite its brightness. Near midday, they stopped beside a frozen creek to rest. Lila May stamped her feet to keep warm while Amos checked Jenny's tack. "Will they find us?" she asked suddenly. "Those railroad men?" Amos tested a leather strap before answering. "Not if we move smart," he said finally. "Town's got more eyes watching, more folks to notice strangers asking questions." He adjusted Jenny's bridle. "Besides, they likely think that patent burned with everything else." They pressed on through the afternoon. The snow-covered valley opened below them, the church steeple rising like a white finger against the blue sky. Amos led them down the least exposed route into town. The church stood silent, its windows glowing amber in the late afternoon light. Amos helped Lila May dismount, then tied Jenny to the hitching post. Inside, warmth from the pot-bellied stove wrapped around them like a blanket. Reverend Dowell looked up from his desk, his thin face showing surprise at the unexpected visitors. "Amos Cutter," he said, rising slowly. "Been a while since you've darkened my door." "Reverend?" Amos removed his hat. "Got someone here needs your counsel." The preacher's wary expression softened as he noticed Lila May standing half-hidden behind Amos's bulk. "Come closer to the stove, child. You look frozen through." "This here's Lila May Hargrove?" Amos said quietly. Recognition flickered across Dowell's weathered features. "Hargrove?" He peered at Lila May more closely. "Why, I remember you, child. Baptized you myself. Must be 15 years back now." His eyes grew distant with memory. "Your father used to come to services regular before the fever took him. Good man, John Hargrove. Always talking about that meadow he'd saved for you." Lila May's head snapped up. "You knew about the meadow?" "Course I did." Dowell gestured them toward the wooden pews. "Your pa was powerful proud of securing that land patent in your name, said it was the best gift he could leave his daughter. Fertile bottomland, water rights and all." Amos and Lila May exchanged glances. Here, finally, was confirmation of what they'd discovered in the charred remains of her home, and perhaps the key to understanding why it had been destroyed. Reverend Dowell stirred the stove's coals, adding another log before settling back into his worn wooden chair. The flames cast dancing shadows across the church's rough-hewn walls. "That meadow's caught more than just your interest," he said gravely. "Railroad man named Brackett's been pressing folks hard to sell their land along the river. Claims he's bringing progress, but his methods ain't exactly Christian." Amos leaned forward, his voice low. "What kind of methods?" "Threats mostly, pressure." The Reverend's weathered face creased with worry. "One family's barn burned mysterious-like after they refused his offer. No proof it was his doing, mind you, but—" He let the words hang. Lila May's hands twisted in her lap. "Like my cabin?" "Could be." Dowell nodded slowly. "Brackett's got men working for him. Rough sorts who don't mind getting their hands dirty." Amos stood, pacing the narrow aisle between pews. "Need to check those land records at the courthouse. Make sure everything's proper and recorded." "The girl can stay here," Dowell offered. "Got a storage room behind the sanctuary, warm enough, and nobody'd think to look." "Much obliged, Reverend." Amos turned to Lila May. "You stay put till I return. Reverend Dowell won't let harm come to you." The courthouse sat squat and gray in the afternoon light, its windows reflecting the winter sky. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. A thin man with ink-stained fingers leafed through a massive ledger at Amos's request. "Hargrove Meadow, you say?" The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "Yes, here's the patent. Signed and proper, but—" He frowned, turning pages. "Don't see where it's been recorded in the county books." "What does that mean?" Amos asked. "Patent's valid, sure enough. But without proper recording?" The clerk shrugged. "Makes ownership claims harder to prove if challenged. Course, that could be fixed with the right paperwork and fees." Amos's jaw tightened. No wonder Brackett had moved so quick. An unrecorded deed was like an open door to men without conscience. He needed to get back to the church. The sun hung low when Amos emerged from the courthouse. He stopped short at the bottom of the steps. Brackett stood waiting, his expensive coat unmarked by trail dust, his smile as smooth as creek ice. "Mr. Cutter," Brackett said pleasantly, "doing some legal research?" "Just passing through?" Amos kept his voice neutral, though his hand itched to rest on his pistol. Brackett pulled a thick envelope from his coat. "Maybe we can help each other. I'm looking for a young lady. Matters of property to discuss. Bring her round to my office. There's $500 here, says we can all profit." "Don't know any young ladies needing your help?" Amos started to walk past. Brackett's voice hardened. "Funny thing about Army records, they show interesting details, like which soldiers decided to leave before their time was up." He smiled again, cold as a snake. "Desertion's still a hanging offense, last I heard." Amos kept walking, his back rigid, but Brackett's words followed him like winter shadows. "Think on it, Cutter. $500 buys a lot of peace of mind." Night settled over the church like a heavy blanket. Lila May slept in the storage room, nested in quilts the Reverend's wife had brought. Amos sat in the front pew, rifle across his knees, watching moonlight filter through the high windows. Snow began falling again, fat flakes drifting past the glass. The quiet deepened, then broke. Hoofbeats crunched in the fresh snow, circling the church slowly. Amos's fingers tightened on his rifle. The sounds drew closer, paused near the side door, then continued around back. Reverend Dowell appeared from his study, a lamp in hand. He nodded to Amos, understanding in his eyes. They waited together as the hoofbeats made another circuit, then gradually faded into the night. "Just letting us know they're watching," Dowell said softly. "Reckon so." Amos checked his rifle's load again. "Come morning, we'll need to move fast. Brackett won't wait long to make his play." "The Lord helps those who stand for right," Dowell said, "but he expects us to be wise as serpents too." Amos grunted agreement, settling deeper into the pew. The snow continued falling, covering their tracks, but he knew morning would bring hard choices. Brackett had shown his hand. Now they had to figure how to play theirs before he turned those threats into action. Through the long night hours, Amos kept his vigil. The rifle stayed ready across his knees, and his eyes never left the church windows. But his mind worked steadily, planning their next move. They'd need to be smarter than Brackett, quicker than his hired guns, and above all, they'd need help. In these mountains, a man alone was just a target waiting to be picked off. The pre-dawn air bit sharp and cold as Amos helped Lila May into Reverend Dowell's wagon. Frost sparkled on the leather reins, and their breath came out in white puffs. The borrowed mare stamped her feet, eager to move in the chill. "Keep that patent close," Amos said, tucking a wool blanket around Lila's shoulders. She nodded, clutching the metal box tight against her chest. Reverend Dowell stepped down from the church porch, his collar turned up against the cold. "Lord watch over you both," he said softly. "I'll do what I can here in town." Amos clicked to the horse, and the wagon creaked into motion. They rolled past silent buildings, windows still dark, snow crunching under the wheels. Every few minutes he glanced back, watching for riders on their trail. "Someone's following," Lila whispered, huddled deep in her blanket. Amos saw them too, two shadowy figures on horseback, keeping their distance. "Just watching for now," he said. "We'll be at the courthouse before they can make trouble." The sun was just touching the mountain peaks when they reached the courthouse steps. Amos helped Lila down, scanning the street. The riders had disappeared, but he kept his rifle close as they hurried inside. The clerk looked up blearily from his morning coffee as they entered. "Early birds today," he said, reaching for his ledger. "Need this patent recorded proper?" Amos said, laying the metal box on the desk. "Right now." The clerk opened the box carefully, examining the document inside. "Everything appears in order." He pulled out several thick books, dipping his pen in ink. Though the recording fee... Amos dropped a stack of coins on the desk. The clerk nodded, beginning to write in his precise hand. Each scratch of the pen seemed to take forever as he copied the details into the county record. Finally, the clerk sprinkled sand over the wet ink, then pressed the official stamp onto the patent with a solid thunk. "There now," he said. "Properly recorded and binding. Nobody can dispute Miss Hargrove's ownership of that meadow." Lila's eyes shone as she took back the patent. "It's really mine now? For certain?" "Sure as sunrise," the clerk said kindly. Outside, they found a small group gathered near the wagon. Amos tensed, but recognized friendly faces. The blacksmith, 2 ranchers, the general store owner's wife. The Reverend's doing, no doubt. "Heard about your trouble?" the blacksmith said gruffly. "Ain't right what Brackett's been pulling. Reckon you could use some friends watching your back." A rancher nodded. "My boys'll keep an eye on that meadow. Let you know if any railroad men come sniffing around." "Much obliged," Amos said, touched by their support. These weren't people who offered help lightly. The store owner's wife pressed a package into Lila's hands. "Some fresh bread and preserves, dear. You come by the store later. We'll get you proper winter clothes." They drove to the general store, hope lifting their spirits. While Lila shopped inside with the owner's wife, Amos loaded the wagon with supplies: flour, coffee, beans, ammunition. He couldn't help overhearing 2 men talking by the pickle barrel. "Brackett's brought in some hard cases," one muttered. 3 gun hands from down Denver way. Mean bunch." "Heard tell they worked for the railroad before," the other replied. "Clearing Indians off the right-of-way. Didn't much care how they did it." Amos's jaw tightened. He'd seen that type before. Men who'd kill for pay without asking questions. They'd need to watch sharp. The sun was setting by the time they reached his cabin, casting long shadows through the pines. Inside, Lila bustled around the fireplace, humming softly as she stirred a pot of beans. The familiar smells of wood smoke and cooking food filled the small space. Amos hung his coat by the door, surprised by how natural it felt having her there. The cabin seemed less empty somehow, warmer beyond just the fire's heat. "We might just win this thing," he said, settling into his chair. "That patent's recorded proper now, and we've got folks willing to stand with us." Lila nodded, adding a pinch of salt to the beans. "Feels good having friends," she said quietly. "Been a long time." Outside, snow began falling again, big flakes drifting past the window. The peaceful scene was broken by a lone wolf's howl, echoing from somewhere in the distant hills. Amos glanced at his rifle, knowing the real danger wasn't from wolves, but from men who'd soon come hunting them. But for now, in the warmth of the cabin with beans bubbling on the fire and Lila's soft humming filling the air, he let himself feel something he hadn't in years: hope. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, not alone. The mountain air held a crisp bite as Amos guided Lila's hands on the rifle. They stood behind his cabin, where he'd propped a tin can on a snow-covered stump. Her breath came out in small white clouds as she concentrated. "Steady now," he said. "Take your time with the aim." Lila squinted down the barrel, her tongue caught between her teeth. The rifle cracked, and the can jumped off the stump. "Well done," Amos nodded, surprised at how quickly she learned. Again. They spent that morning practicing with the rifle until Lila's shoulder grew sore. After a simple lunch of cornbread and dried venison, Amos showed her how to set snares along the rabbit runs near the creek. "See how the wire loops just so?" he demonstrated, with careful hands. "Animal comes through here, trigger catches, and—" he made a quick gesture. Lila watched intently. "Like threading a needle, almost," she said. Her fingers were nimble as she set her own snare, earning another nod from Amos. The next day brought clear skies and warmer temperatures. They took advantage of the break in weather to haul firewood from the timber. Amos showed her how to stack the logs properly against the cabin wall, creating a sturdy wall of wood that would keep them warm through winter storms. As they worked, Lila spoke of her dreams in quiet snatches. "Used to imagine having my own schoolhouse," she said, passing him another log, "teaching children their letters and sums." "That so?" Amos asked, surprised to find himself interested. "Mm-hmm. Pa taught me reading when I was little. Said education was precious as gold out here." Her voice grew soft. "He'd have liked seeing me teach." Amos studied her face, seeing the strength behind her gentle features. "Still might," he said, "once this business is settled." On the third evening, their supplies ran low. The lamp oil was nearly gone, and they'd used the last of the salt that morning. "I'd best ride to town," Amos said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Won't take but a few hours." Lila looked up from where she was mending a torn shirt. "I'll be fine here," she said firmly. "Got the rifle and plenty of firewood." Amos hesitated at the door. "Keep the bar down," he said. "Don't open for nobody but me." "I know," she smiled. "Now go on, before it gets full dark." The trail to town was clear enough, though clouds were building in the west. Amos's mule picked its way carefully down the slope as shadows lengthened across the snow. The general store's windows glowed warmly as he approached. Inside, he quickly gathered what they needed: salt, lamp oil, coffee, and some hard candy he thought Lila might enjoy. As he paid, fat snowflakes began falling outside the windows. "Better hurry," the store owner said, glancing at the weather. "Storm's coming in fast." Amos mounted up, pulling his collar high against the wind. The snow thickened as he rode, making it harder to see the trail. Halfway home, something caught his eye. Fresh horse tracks cutting across his path, heading toward his cabin. His chest tightened. 3 sets of prints. The snow barely settled in them. "Hi-yah!" He kicked the mule harder than he meant to, fear rising in his throat. The animal scrambled up the trail, sensing his urgency. Through the falling snow, Amos caught the smell of wood smoke. Too much of it, wrong somehow. The cabin came into view, and his heart stopped. The door hung crooked on its hinges, splintered near the lock. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thick column, as if someone had dumped water on the fire. "Lila!" he shouted, jumping down before the mule fully stopped. No answer came from the dark doorway. Inside, the cabin was chaos. The table lay overturned, his few dishes scattered and broken. The quilt he'd given Lila lay crumpled on the floor, one corner singed where it had been thrown too near the fire. Her mending work was trampled into the dirt. Amos's hands shook as he lit the lamp. Boot prints marked the floor, showing signs of a struggle. Lila hadn't gone easily. An overturned chair, a bloody smear on the wall where someone had hit their head. He found her hairpin by the door, bent and broken. Outside, 3 sets of horse tracks led away into the gathering dark, partially filled with fresh snow. One horse's prints ran deeper than the others, carrying extra weight. Amos stood in the doorway, cold, settling into his bones that had nothing to do with the storm. He'd promised to protect her, to keep her safe. Now she was gone, taken by men who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her to get what they wanted. The tracks were disappearing under the falling snow. Soon, they'd be lost completely. Amos hurried to gather his gear: rifle, ammunition, rope, food he could eat while riding. His hands moved automatically while his mind raced ahead, tracking where they might have taken her. The railroad office was in town, but Brackett wasn't fool enough to hold her there. No, they'd have somewhere more isolated, away from prying eyes, somewhere they could pressure her to sign away her land without witnesses. As Amos saddled his mule with practiced speed, he heard Lila's voice in his memory. "I'd rather freeze than go back." She'd trusted him to keep her safe, and he'd failed. But by God, he'd find her. Whatever it took, he'd bring her home. The snow fell heavier now, but Amos could still make out the tracks leading down toward the valley. He mounted up, rifle across his saddle, and urged the mule forward into the storm, Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Lila needed him. This time, he wouldn't let her down. Amos's heart hammered against his ribs as he stuffed extra cartridges into his coat pockets. His fingers trembled, but years of mountain discipline steadied them as he checked his rifle one final time. The mule stamped impatiently in the falling snow, steam rising from its flanks. He lifted the brass lantern and swung into the saddle, holding the light low to illuminate the tracks. 3 horses had passed this way less than an hour ago, their hoofprints still sharp in the fresh powder. The trail led down toward the valley, where deep drifts would make tracking nearly impossible in the dark. After half a mile, the tracks began filling with snow. Amos dismounted, crouching to study the ground. The lantern light caught the edges of the prints, but they were fading fast. He cursed under his breath. Alone, he'd lose them completely before dawn. "Think," he muttered, straightening up. The nearest help was 5 miles away, Nantan's winter camp. The old Ute elder had been a friend for years, teaching Amos the ways of the high country when he first came to these mountains. If anyone could follow a cold trail through snow, it would be Nantan's people. Amos turned his mule east, leaving the kidnapper's trail behind. The animal seemed to sense his urgency, picking up its pace, despite the deepening snow. They followed a game trail through stands of black timber, branches creaking overhead in the wind. The lantern light caught ice crystals in the air, making them sparkle like falling stars. It was past midnight when he spotted the glow of campfires through the trees. 2 dogs began barking, and a figure emerged from a hide-covered shelter, rifle raised. "Who comes?" a voice called in Ute. "Amos Cutter," he answered in the same language, though his accent was rough. "I seek Nantan's counsel." More figures appeared, wrapped in wool blankets against the cold. One of them was Nantan, his silver hair gleaming in the firelight. The elder studied Amos's face for a long moment. "Something drives you through the storm, friend," Nantan said in English. "Come, warm yourself and speak of it." Inside Nantan's shelter, a small fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Amos crouched near the flames, accepting a cup of strong tea. In measured words, he explained about Lila, the land claim, and Brackett's threats. When he described finding the cabin ransacked, Nantan's expression grew grim. "These railroad men," the elder said, "they are like wolves who wear men's clothes. They make promises with forked tongues, then take what they want." He set his cup down. "How long ago did they pass?" "Less than 2 hours. But the snow?" Nantan nodded. "We will need good eyes for this trail." He spoke rapidly in Ute to a young man near the door. Minutes later, 2 trackers appeared, carrying rifles and leather bags. Nantan introduced them as Bear Runner and Swift Fox, brothers known for their skill at following sign. "We rest until first light," Nantan decided. "Then we hunt these kidnappers." Amos wanted to argue, to ride out immediately, but he knew the elder was right. They'd never find the trail in darkness. He settled back against a pole, watching the fire burn low. Sleep eluded him as he imagined Lila, frightened and cold, in the hands of Brackett's men. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm blown out during the night. The tracking party set out as the first light touched the peaks. Amos, Nantan, and the 2 brothers, all mounted on sturdy ponies. They rode to Amos's cabin first, where Bear Runner and Swift Fox studied the signs of struggle. 3 men on horses," Bear Runner said, pointing to marks in the snow. "One carries the girl. They ride heavy, armed with rifles." The brothers led the way down the trail Amos had followed the night before. The snow lay knee-deep on the horses, but the Utes seemed to read the ground like a book, finding bent twigs and displaced rocks that Amos would have missed. Around midday, Swift Fox raised his hand. The party halted as he dismounted, moving to a snow-laden branch. Something pale fluttered there, a scrap of cloth torn from Lila's dress. Amos's throat tightened as he recognized the flowered pattern. "She marks the trail for us," Nantan said quietly. "Your girl has courage." The tracks led steadily downward, toward the frozen river flats where summer cattle grazed. Bear Runner pointed out how the horses' gait had slowed, their riders likely tired from fighting the snow. They were gaining ground. As darkness approached, Nantan guided them into a sheltered ravine, where thick pines kept the snow shallow. They made a small fire, screened by branches to hide its light. The brothers took turns standing watch while the others ate strips of dried meat and pemmican, a mixture of preserved berries and fat that Nantan had brought. Amos stared into the flames, memories washing over him. He'd sworn never to raise a rifle against another man after deserting the army. That oath had helped him live with himself, helped quiet the nightmares of what he'd seen done to innocent people. But now, Lord, he whispered, not caring if the others heard, keep her safe until I find her, and give me strength to face what's coming without becoming what I was before. His hands clasped together, knuckles white in the firelight. Help me do what's right, not just what's easy. Nantan's voice came softly from across the fire. The Creator hears all prayers, friend, but sometimes He answers them through the hands of those who act with good hearts. Amos looked up, meeting the elder's steady gaze. In it, he saw understanding and determination that matched his own. Whatever tomorrow brought, he wouldn't face it alone. First light painted the eastern sky in pale stripes of pink and gold. The rescue party mounted their horses without speaking, each man checking his weapons one final time. Amos pulled his wool scarf higher against the biting wind as they set out, following Bear Runner's lead through the awakening forest. The cold cut sharp as a knife, making their eyes water and freezing their breath into white clouds. Snow pelted their faces, driven sideways by gusts that rattled the bare branches overhead. The horses picked their way carefully across ice-slicked rocks and frozen creek beds, their hooves breaking through crusted snow with hollow crunches. They passed through a stand of aspen trees, their white trunks ghostly in the morning light. The branches above were bare, scratching against each other in the wind like dry bones. Swift Fox rode point now, his dark eyes scanning the ground ahead for signs of their quarry. Near midday, the young tracker raised his hand in a sharp gesture. The party drew to a halt, every man alert. Swift Fox pointed ahead. A thin tendril of wood smoke rose above the trees, almost invisible against the gray sky. Amos's heart quickened. They'd found them. Nantan guided them up a snow-covered ridge where they could observe unseen. Lying flat in the powder, Amos pulled out his brass spyglass and studied the camp below. It sat on the edge of Lila's meadow, where the land dropped away toward the river. 3 men huddled around a smoking fire, their shoulders hunched against the wind. A fourth figure, Brackett, paced near a canvas-topped wagon, gesturing as he spoke to his men. And there, tied to the wagon's rear wheel, was Lila. She wore someone's oversized coat, but Amos could see she was shivering. Her face was pale with cold, yet her chin was lifted in that familiar, stubborn angle. Even from here he could read the defiance in her posture. "She lives," Amos whispered, passing the spyglass to Nantan. "But we can't rush in. Too exposed." The Ute elder studied the scene carefully before speaking. "The night will be our ally. Cold drives men close to fire, makes them blind to shadows." Bear Runner nodded in agreement. "We have watched such camps before. In darkness, their eyes will be fixed on flames. They will not see us come." "Then we wait," Amos said, though every instinct screamed at him to act now. He forced himself to think clearly, to plan like the soldier he'd once been. "We'll need to get the horses closer before sunset." They retreated to a low hollow half a mile from the camp, where thick pines offered shelter from the wind. The brothers took turns keeping watch, while the others tended the horses and chewed on pemmican. Amos cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time, each motion practiced and precise. Nantan watched him with knowing eyes. "You think of other battles," the elder said quietly. Amos's hands stilled on the weapon. "Thinking of what I won't let happen this time." He remembered Lila's words that first night, how she'd declared she'd rather freeze than go back. Her courage shamed his initial suspicion. She trusted me to keep her safe. I aim to honor that trust. The afternoon light faded quickly, heavy clouds rolling in to blot out the moon. Perfect weather for what they planned. As true darkness fell, they led the horses closer to the camp, leaving them ground-tied in a sheltered draw. The cold had indeed drawn Brackett's men toward their fire. Through the trees, Amos could see their hunched forms, passing a bottle between them. Only one man stood guard, stamping his feet and swinging his arms against the chill. Lila remained by the wagon, but she'd managed to work herself into a more comfortable position. Even in the dim light, Amos could see she was watching the men carefully, measuring them just as he was. That sharp mind of hers was still working, still fighting. Bear Runner touched Amos's arm, pointing to himself and Swift Fox, then gesturing to either side of the camp. The brothers would circle around using the darkness for cover. Nantan would stay with the horses, ready for their retreat. Amos checked his rifle one final time, then nodded to the trackers. They moved out like shadows, their moccasins silent in the snow. He waited until he could no longer see them, counting his breaths slowly. The wind moaned through the trees, covering any small sounds of their approach. Memories tried to surface, other nights, other battles, but Amos pushed them away. This was different. This was about protecting someone who needed him, about making right choices instead of following brutal orders. He touched the stock of his rifle and whispered a final prayer. The clouds rolled thicker, darkness deepening until the campfire seemed to float in a sea of black. Amos waited for the signal, every muscle tense. Somewhere in that darkness, 2 Ute warriors were getting into position, and in the firelight ahead, a brave young woman was counting on him to keep his word. Amos crept forward through the swirling snow, keeping low to the ground. Wind whipped his coat, helping to mask any sound of movement. The campfire cast dancing shadows across the clearing, making the darkness seem even deeper beyond its reach. 20 paces from the wagon now. 15? 10? Lila's head snapped up as he drew closer, her eyes widening in recognition. She pressed her lips together tightly, fighting to keep her face neutral, but Amos could see the hope blazing in her expression. He raised one finger to his lips, though the gesture wasn't needed. She knew to keep quiet. Through the falling snow, he caught glimpses of Swift Fox sliding through the shadows behind the guards. The young tracker's knife glinted dully as he worked his way toward the picketed horses. Bear Runner had disappeared entirely into the darkness on the far side of the camp. The wind gusted harder, driving smoke from the fire in wild swirls. Amos used the cover to close the final distance to the wagon. He could see the rope binding Lila's hands now, the knots crusted with ice. His fingers reached for his knife. A sudden bout of coughing broke the night's rhythm. One of Brackett's men stumbled away from the fire, bent double and hacking. He took 3 unsteady steps, then straightened, and found himself staring directly at Amos. "Raiders!" The guard's shout split the night. "Behind the wagon!" Chaos erupted in an instant. The other guards leaped up, grabbing for weapons. Swift Fox slashed through the horses' lead ropes. The animals reared and bucked, screaming in panic. A rifle cracked, the muzzle flash bright in the darkness. Amos dropped to one knee, sawing through Lila's bonds with desperate speed. "Run when I say," he growled, working the blade against the frozen rope. "Nantan's waiting in the trees." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Wood splintered on the wagon wheel above their heads. Lila flinched but held steady, letting him work at the ropes. The last strands parted. "Now!" Amos shoved her toward the darkness. "Go!" She bolted like a startled deer, disappearing into the snow-filled night. Amos brought his rifle up, firing once to keep the guards' heads down. Bear Runner's war cry sounded from the far side of the camp, followed by more gunfire and shouting. "That's far enough, Cutter!" The cold voice cut through the chaos. Amos turned slowly, rifle still raised. Brackett stood at the edge of the firelight, a Colt revolver pointed steadily at Amos's chest. The railroad man's face was calm, almost amused. "Drop it," Brackett ordered, "unless you're eager to have another desertion on your conscience. Permanent this time." Amos's finger tightened on the trigger. The camp had gone eerily quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse whinnied nervously. "Last chance, Cutter. The girl's patent isn't worth dying for." "Ain't about the patent?" Amos's voice was steel. "It's about keeping promises." The standoff held for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. Then a new voice rang out from the darkness. "Drop your weapon, Mr. Brackett." Reverend Dowell stepped into the firelight, rifle leveled. Behind him came more figures. Thompson from the general store, Miller the blacksmith, young Webb who worked the telegraph office. A dozen townspeople materialized from the snowy night, all armed, all grim-faced. Brackett's composed expression cracked. His eyes darted from side to side, counting rifles. "This isn't your concern," he snapped at the Reverend. "This is railroad business." "This is about right and wrong," Dowell replied evenly. "About protecting our own from men who'd burn out a widow and steal from an orphaned girl. The Lord sees, Mr. Brackett, and so do we." More townspeople appeared from the darkness. Amos recognized faces from the courthouse, the church, the cafe, neighbors who'd decided to stand together against the railroad's greed. Brackett's gun hand wavered. His remaining men looked uncertainly at each other, then carefully laid their weapons in the snow. "The patent," Amos said quietly. "Hand it over." For a moment he thought Brackett might refuse. Then the railroad man's shoulders slumped. Moving slowly, he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folio. "This won't stop the railroad," he said, tossing it at Amos's feet. "There'll be other meadows, other routes." "Reckon so." Amos picked up the folio, checking that Lila's patent was inside. "But not here. Not today." Nantan appeared at the edge of the firelight, Lila safe beside him. The Ute elder's face was grave as he surveyed the scene. "The horses are secured," he reported. "The brothers watch the trail. No more of Brackett's men approach." Reverend Dowell stepped forward, his rifle still trained on Brackett. "Marshall's been telegraphed. He'll want to hear about the cabin burning, I expect, and the kidnapping, and whatever else comes to light under proper questioning." Brackett's face twisted, but he kept silent. His men looked beaten. Shoulders slumped as the townspeople moved in to bind their hands. Amos crossed to where Lila stood. She was shivering, but her eyes were bright with triumph as he handed her the patent. "Told you I'd rather freeze than go back," she said, managing a small smile, despite chattering teeth. "Reckon you did at that?" Amos felt an answering smile tugging at his mouth. "Reckon you did." Dawn broke pale and cold over the mountain town. Fresh snow draped the buildings in white, untouched except for a single line of tracks down the middle of the street. Following those tracks, a grim procession made its way toward the jailhouse. Brackett and his men shuffled through the snow, their hands bound with hemp rope. Townspeople lined the boardwalks, watching in silence as Sheriff Rourke and 4 deputies marched the prisoners forward. Amos walked behind them, his rifle cradled ready across his arm. The exhaustion of the night showed in the dark circles under his eyes, but his stance remained alert. The small stone jail stood at the end of the street, its iron-barred windows glinting in the early light. Sheriff Rourke unlocked the heavy door, its hinges creaking in the cold. One by one, he shepherded the prisoners inside. Brackett paused at the threshold, turning to glare at Amos. "The railroad doesn't forget," he said quietly. "Neither do we," Sheriff Rourke replied, giving him a firm push through the doorway. The lock clicked shut with finality. Reverend Dowell stepped forward from the crowd, his breath making clouds in the frigid air. "If you'll all follow me to the courthouse," he called out, "we have one more matter to attend to." The townsfolk moved as one toward the courthouse, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Lila walked beside Amos, her borrowed coat pulled tight against the cold. Her face showed the strain of the night, but her steps were steady. Inside the courthouse, the clerk pulled out the heavy record book and laid it on the wooden podium. Reverend Dowell cleared his throat and began to read in his clear, carrying voice. Let it be known and recorded that on this 15th day of January, 1881, the land patent for River Meadow Plot 17, comprising 160 acres, is hereby confirmed as the legal property of Miss Lila May Hargrove, by right of inheritance and proper filing of deed. A quiet round of applause rippled through the gathered crowd. Thompson from the general store reached out to shake Lila's hand. "Well done, miss," he said gruffly. "Your pa would be proud." More townspeople stepped forward to offer congratulations. Miller the blacksmith promised to help rebuild her cabin come spring. Webb from the telegraph office said he'd send word to the territorial capital about Brackett's crimes. Even Mrs. Potter, who ran the cafe, pressed a wrapped loaf of fresh bread into Lila's hands. Amos stood back, watching the scene with tired eyes. When the last well-wishers had dispersed, he touched Lila's elbow gently. "Best we head back," he said. "Daylight's burning, and there's work to be done." They rode through the deepening morning, the mule plowing steadily through drifts. The sun climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Neither spoke much, both too weary for conversation. When they crested the final ridge, Amos's cabin came into view. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and part of the roof gaped open to the sky. But the stone chimney still stood strong, and the log walls held firm. "Could be worse," Amos muttered, dismounting stiffly. They worked through the afternoon, Amos up on the roof laying new shakes while Lila handed them up. The physical labor helped drive away the memory of the night's fear. Inside, they swept up scattered belongings and righted overturned furniture. Lila salvaged what she could of the supplies, sorting through spilled flour and scattered dried beans. As evening approached, she insisted on cooking. "You need proper food," she told Amos firmly, "not just jerky and cold biscuits." He didn't argue, just nodded and went out to split more firewood. The steady thunk of the axe provided rhythm as Lila worked in the cabin, humming softly while she prepared a thick venison stew with the last of their stores. The sun had set by the time they sat down to eat. The repaired roof creaked slightly in the wind, but the cabin was warm and snug. Lamplight gleamed on tin plates and cups, and the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. They ate in comfortable silence, too hungry for talk. Amos found himself watching Lila across the table, noting how naturally she seemed to fit in the cabin's small space. Her presence had somehow made the rough-hewn room feel more like a home than a mere shelter. The thought of the cabin returning to its former emptiness sat heavy in his chest. She caught him looking and smiled, tired but content. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Amos nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady in the gathering dark. A week passed like water flowing under winter ice. Each day brought subtle changes, icicles dripping from the eaves, snow settling deeper into itself, patches of dark earth emerging on south-facing slopes. The air grew softer, carrying hints of the change to come. Inside the cabin, Amos spread a rough-drawn map across the table while Lila leaned in close, studying the curved line that marked the river's course through her meadow. Morning light streamed through the window, catching dust motes in its beam. "Reckon we'll need near 200 posts for proper fencing," Amos said, his finger tracing the boundary lines. "Can cut most of them from the stand of lodgepole pine up valley." Lila nodded, making notes in a small ledger she'd bought from Thompson's store. "How long to build the cabin?" "With help, maybe 3 weeks." Amos scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Less if we get the logs cut before the ground thaws. Main thing is having the foundation set proper." "Could we go see it today?" Lila asked, her eyes bright with purpose. "I want to walk it again, now the snow's settling." Amos glanced outside. The sun rode high in a clear sky, promising a few hours of relative warmth. Might as well, he agreed. River should be crossable if we're careful. They saddled up after the midday meal, Lila now comfortable handling her borrowed mare. The trail down from the cabin was well packed from their daily trips to check snares. Fresh rabbit tracks dotted the snow, and a woodpecker's drilling echoed through the trees. At the river crossing, Amos dismounted to test the ice. Water ran clear and fast in the center channel, but thick shelves extended from both banks. He led them across single file, choosing spots where the ice lay anchored to large rocks. The meadow opened before them like a blank page waiting to be written upon. Snow still covered most of the ground, but patches of tawny grass showed through where the wind had scoured it bare. Their horses' hooves broke through the crusty surface, leaving deep tracks behind. Lila slid from her saddle, walking slowly along what would become her fence line. Her boots crunched in the snow as she moved from one boundary marker to the next. Here and there, she knelt to touch the frozen grass stems poking through as if reading their promise of spring. "Wild iris grows here," she said, more to herself than Amos, "and paintbrush come summer. Father used to say this meadow had the prettiest wildflowers in the territory." She stood brushing snow from her skirts and gestured toward the far end. "The cabin should go there, I think, where that little rise is. Then I can see the whole meadow from my door." Amos nodded approval. The spot she'd chosen offered good drainage and shelter from the prevailing winds. More importantly, it showed she was thinking like someone who meant to stay. Movement caught his eye. 3 riders approaching from the west, following the river's course. He recognized Nantan's straight-backed posture and relaxed his grip on his rifle. The Ute elder rode up slowly, 2 younger men flanking him. All 3 sat their horses with the easy grace of those born to the saddle. Nantan raised his hand in greeting, then dismounted to stand before them. "The warm wind brings change," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Soon the grass will grow again." "It does," Amos agreed. "Good to see you, friend." Nantan's dark eyes took in the meadow, noting the boundary markers. "This is good grazing land," he said. "Our people have brought horses here in summer, since before my father's time." Lila stepped forward, her chin lifted. "You're welcome to continue," she said firmly. "There's grass enough to share." A slight smile touched Nantan's weathered face. "You speak with a generous heart, but such things should be properly agreed upon." "What do you propose?" Amos asked. "My people will help build your fence and cabin when spring comes," Nantan said. "In return, we graze our horses here during the moon of ripening berries. We will respect your boundaries and help watch your land when you are away." Lila glanced at Amos, who gave a small nod. She turned back to Nantan and extended her hand. "I would be honored by such an arrangement." Nantan clasped her offered hand gravely. "Then it is agreed. We will return when the snow melts from the high peaks." One of the younger men spoke quietly in Ute. Nantan listened, then added, "My nephew says his wife will show you which plants are good for medicine, if you wish to learn." "I would like that very much," Lila replied. The meeting concluded with the formal courtesy that marked such agreements in the high country. As Nantan and his companions rode away, their horses' hooves kicked up small clouds of snow that glittered in the afternoon light. Amos and Lila remained in the meadow, walking its boundaries once more, while discussing plans for spring. The sun had passed its peak, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Above them, a lone eagle circled on rising thermals, its wings spread wide against the deep blue sky. Lila stopped, watching the bird's lazy spiral. "I never thought I'd have this," she said softly. "Somewhere that's truly mine. People who—" She hesitated, searching for words. "Who care what happens to you?" Amos suggested. She nodded. "More than that. People who make me feel like I belong here." like this is where I'm meant to be. Amos understood. He'd spent years avoiding such connections, telling himself he preferred solitude. But watching Lila these past weeks, seeing her determination to build something lasting, her willingness to trust again despite everything, had awakened something he'd thought long buried. "Best head back," he said gruffly, emotion making his voice rough. "Lights fading?" They rode home as the day's warmth began to fade, following their outbound tracks through the snow. The eagle still wheeled overhead, riding the last thermals before sunset. Its wild cry echoed across the valley, a sound as ancient and free as the mountains themselves. Spring announced itself in fits and starts across the high country. Some mornings dawned bitter cold, while others brought sudden warmth that sent rivulets of snowmelt coursing down every hillside. The change of seasons played out in small signs, pussy willows breaking their silver buds, the return of red-winged blackbirds to the marshes, and the steady drip of icicles surrendering to the strengthening sun. The trail between town and the meadow turned treacherous with mud. What had been firmly packed snow became a morass of half-frozen earth that sucked at boots and wagon wheels alike. But Amos and Lila made the journey regularly, leading their sturdy mule, loaded with lumber from Thompson's sawmill. "Steady now," Amos called, as the mule's hooves slipped on a particularly steep section. The animal snorted, steam rising from its flanks, but kept its footing. Behind it, the rough-cut boards shifted and creaked against their rope bindings. Lila walked ahead, testing uncertain ground with a long stick. Her skirts were mud-spattered to the knee, but her face glowed with determination. "There's a firmer patch just ahead," she called back. "We can rest there a spell." They'd made this trip 6 times already, each load of lumber bringing them closer to their goal. The foundation logs were already in place, shaped and fitted by Amos's skilled hands. Stone gathered from the riverbed would form the chimney, and split shakes were stacked nearby, waiting to become the roof. Word had spread through the scattered homesteads and mining camps that Lila Mae Hargrove was building on her father's meadow. Help arrived in the way of the frontier, without fanfare or formal invitation, but steady and sure as the spring itself. Old Jeff Mason brought his team of oxen to help drag the heaviest logs. The Weber sisters, whose farm lay 2 miles downstream, arrived with baskets of fresh bread and stew for the workers. Even Thompson, the lumber merchant, had cut his prices when he learned whose cabin the wood was for. On a clear morning in early April, Nantan arrived with 6 strong men from his band. They worked with quiet efficiency, their practiced movements speaking of generations spent building in these mountains. By sundown, the cabin's walls had risen halfway to their full height. "Your home grows strong," Nantan told Lila as they shared coffee around the evening fire. "Built with many hands, it will shelter many hearts." The Reverend Dowell made regular visits, often bringing donations from his congregation. A window frame here, a length of stovepipe there. On a bright Sunday morning, he held service right there in the meadow, the half-built cabin standing proud behind him. "Let us bless this land," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the grass where tiny green shoots were just beginning to emerge. Not only the soil and water that sustain life, but the spirit of community that brings us together in common purpose. The small congregation, a mix of homesteaders, Ute families, and townsfolk, bowed their heads as one. Lila stood between Amos and Nantan, her eyes bright with unshed tears. As April deepened toward May, the cabin took its final shape. The roof went on during 2 days of intense labor, everyone rushing to finish before an approaching storm. The stone chimney rose straight and true, its draft tested by small fires before the proper stove was installed. Windows were set and chinked, their glass panes gleaming in the spring sunlight. A plank floor replaced the packed earth, and shelves appeared along the walls. Each addition made the space feel more like home. Amos worked tirelessly, his experience showing in every careful joint and level beam. But more than skill went into his labor. Something else drove him, a fierce dedication to building this sanctuary exactly right. When asked why he took such care with every detail, he simply shrugged and said, "Gotta be done proper." The evening of the final day dawned mild and clear. Most of the helpers had gone home, leaving only a few finishing touches for Amos and Lila to complete. The meadow grass now reached past their ankles, dotted here and there with early wildflowers. Amos stood back from the cabin, studying its lines in the fading light. The fresh-cut pine logs glowed honey gold, and thin wreaths of smoke rose from the chimney, where Lila was testing her new stove. The door, hung just that morning, stood slightly ajar, letting out the mingled smells of wood shavings and boiling coffee. Through the window he could see Lila moving about inside, setting her few possessions in their places. She had changed in these weeks of building, growing more confident with each day. The uncertain girl who had appeared at his door in a snowstorm was becoming a capable young woman who knew her own mind. She stepped onto the small porch, wiping her hands on her apron. A smile spread across her face, one Amos had never seen before. It held joy, certainly, but something deeper too. Pride, perhaps, or the quiet satisfaction of seeing a dream made real? "Coffee's ready," she said, still smiling. "First pot brewed in my own home." Amos nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, boots thumping on the new planks. Inside, the cabin was warm and bright, filled with the rich scent of coffee and the sharp, clean smell of fresh-cut pine. Lila poured 2 cups, handling the hot kettle with practiced ease. They sat at the small table by the window, another gift from the community made by the carpenter's widow in town. Through the glass, they could see the last light painting the western sky in shades of pink and gold. "Hard to believe it's real sometimes," Lila said softly, running her hand along the smooth tabletop. "Having a place of my own. People who—" She paused, searching for words. "People who care," Amos finished for her. It was something he was learning too, that caring went both ways, binding people together like the joints of a well-built home. The coffee steamed in their cups, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, a meadowlark sang its evening song. The cabin held them in its newborn warmth, solid and sure as the promise of tomorrow. By early summer, the meadow had transformed into a sea of green, dotted with splashes of color, where wildflowers nodded in the warm breeze. Purple lupines and bright yellow buttercups swayed alongside delicate white daisies, their petals catching the late afternoon sun. The grass grew thick and lush, reaching past knee-height in places, whispering secrets to the wind. Lila's cabin stood proudly against this backdrop, a testament to community and perseverance. Thin wisps of wood smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the promise of a warm hearth within. The logs had weathered just enough to lose their raw brightness, settling into the mellow golden brown of seasoned timber. Morning glories, carefully transplanted from the woods, had begun their determined climb up the corner posts of the small porch. Amos guided his mule along the well-worn path that led to Lila's door. In his saddlebags, a cloth sack of flour shifted with each step, and a string of fresh-caught trout, their scales still gleaming, swayed from his saddle horn. The sound of the rushing river provided a constant backdrop to the meadow's summer symphony of birdsong and buzzing insects. As he approached, the cabin's door swung open. Lila stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face broke into a warm smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The scared girl from that winter night was gone, replaced by a young woman who had found her place in the world. "Come inside," she called out, her voice carrying a teasing lilt. "Supper's waitin'." The words echoed their first meeting, but now they held warmth instead of desperation. Amos felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward as he dismounted, his boots pressing into the soft earth of the path. "Brought you some flour," he said, lifting the sack from his saddlebag, "and some trout fresh from the river." "Just in time," Lila replied, taking the flour. "I was down to my last cup, and these fish'll go perfect with the wild onions I gathered this morning." Inside, the cabin glowed with the kind of warmth that came from daily living. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their subtle fragrance mixing with the scent of fresh-baked bread. A patch of sunlight fell through the western window, catching the edge of the table, where 2 places had been carefully set. Lila had arranged wildflowers in a tin can at the center of the table, their colors bright against the scrubbed wooden surface. The sight of those two waiting plates stirred something in Amos's chest, a feeling of rightness he couldn't quite name. "You didn't have to set a place for me," he said gruffly, though they both knew it was just for show. These shared suppers had become as regular as the sun's rising. "Course I did," Lila answered, already moving to prepare the trout. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency as she cleaned and seasoned the fish. "Who else would appreciate my cooking proper?" They fell into their familiar routine, Amos building up the fire while Lila worked at the stove. The fish sizzled in the pan, and soon the cabin filled with savory aromas that made his stomach growl appreciatively. Through the open window came the endless song of the river, full with summer's bounty. The water ran deep and clear now, carrying snowmelt from the high peaks. Its voice had become as familiar to Lila as it had long been to Amos, a constant companion that marked the passing of days. The meadow hummed with life around them. Bees drifted lazy paths between the flowers, and somewhere nearby, a meadowlark trilled its evening song. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of wild roses through the window, mixing with the cooking smells inside. They sat down to eat as the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains. The fish was perfectly cooked, flaking easily under their forks. Fresh bread and wild onions rounded out the meal, along with the last preserves from winter. "Remember that first night?" Lila asked, breaking a piece of bread. "When you looked at me like I was some kind of ghost on your doorstep?" Amos nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Reckon I didn't know what to make of you then." "And now?" "Now?" He paused, considering. "Now I reckon you're about the stubbornest young woman I ever met. And thank the Lord for that." Lila laughed, the sound bright and clear as a mountain stream. "Had to be, dealing with a ornery old mountain man like yourself." Their conversation flowed easy and natural, like the river outside. The weight of that desperate winter had lifted, leaving behind something stronger than either of them had expected. They talked about the meadow, about the wild strawberries beginning to ripen in the sunny patches, about the deer that came to drink at the river in the early mornings. As dusk began to settle over the land, Amos found himself studying the cabin's interior. Lila had made it truly her own. Quilts from the townswomen brightened the walls, and her father's old books lined a rough-hewn shelf. Everything had its place, spoke of care and belonging. The realization came to him slowly, settling in his heart like snow settling on pine branches. He was no longer the solitary figure who had lived so long apart from others. Somewhere between that stormy night and this peaceful evening, he had become part of something larger, a family, chosen and hard-won through trials and trust. This understanding didn't come with any great flash of insight or sudden emotion. Instead, it felt as natural as the changing of seasons, as right as the way the cabin fit into the landscape of the meadow. He belonged here, in this moment, sharing supper with this brave young woman who had somehow become as dear to him as any daughter could be. The river ran full outside, carrying its endless song into the gathering darkness. Inside, the lamp's warm glow caught the contentment on Lila's face as she rose to clear the plates, humming softly to herself. The cabin held them both in its sturdy embrace, a shelter built by many hands, but made into a home by just two hearts. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.